Right. Okay, so we want to make this interactive. We know that a lot of you have probably been sitting on Zoom calls for a long time or just conference calls in general and get kind of boring. And we want you to feel like you're a part of this presentation and you're a part of the census. So we're going to have some chat box activities throughout the presentation. It's totally okay if you don't know the answer because we will hopefully get to answer all these questions for you. So let's start off with what is the census? So if you can use your chat box and just list off what the census is. Can you tell me anything about it? What is it used for? Anything like that. So let's take about 30 seconds. Feel free to use the chat box and chat us, and then we'll go from there. Great, first answer, funding for local community programs. Yes, the census data is used to help understand how local community programs are funded. City and state officials use it to look for how to distribute that funding. Do other people have thoughts on what the census is used for? Great, counting every resident of the US to determine funding and representation. Yes, that's right. And it's every 10 years, that's also right. All right, we'll give another 10 seconds. Great, yes, I'm seeing a lot of right answers in here. You all are census experts. Great. Okay, we're gonna go to the next slide and you'll get to learn a little bit more about the census. Great, so again, a lot of you already were starting to respond with some of these. But again, the census is a count of every person in the US and it happens every 10 years. And again, this is every person, so it doesn't matter if you're a citizen or not a citizen. If you live in the US, you get counted. It's also in the Constitution, and it is not the American Community Survey. So we say that because a lot of people think of the census as this really long form that's really intrusive when it comes to questions. That's actually not the decennial census. That's called the American Community Survey. And you may get questions about this because the American Community Survey goes out every year, and it goes out to about 3% of the population. So some people will get that survey this year. But the census is only 10 questions. It's very quick. And a lot of you have probably already filled it out. Maybe you can note in the chat box if you've already filled out your census, which is very exciting. So that is a lot shorter than the American Community Survey. Next slide. Great, so why is the census important? What we like to do is kind of think about what's happened in the past 10 years. So I like to think about my sister. 10 years ago, she wasn't married and she didn't have a kid. And so think about where you were 10 years ago. So for my sister, and in the next 10 years, her kid, if her kid is not counted on the census this year, then they may be missed in their community over the next 10 years. And so that's less resources for that community, especially if a lot of people are missing on a larger scale. So think about like where you were 10 years ago and how much has changed in your life and how important it is to ensure that you're getting counted and your community is getting counted so that you're able to access those resources and have that representation over the next decade. Go to the next slide. Great, and a lot of you mentioned some of the resources that census data is used for, but here's just a list. So think about enforcing civil rights. That goes towards education, employment, voting, housing, healthcare, and criminal justice. So when looking at how the distribution of resources are used and also especially how lines are drawn, they're looking to see that this is also fair and is following the legal, the laws that are in place to enforce civil rights. We also want to feed, shelter, protect, heal, and build. So a lot of those resources you talked about in the chat, like programs specifically for Medicaid and Medicare, Pell Grants, SNAP, when you think of the free lunches in schools, all of those programs are directly derived from census data. So the federal government's going to look at what is the population in various states and provide those resources looking at that census data. So it's very important. And then again, representation. So thinking about how many electoral votes that states get, how many representatives are in the House of Representatives, that's all looking at census data. So it's very important. But even at a local and state level, you can see that representation and the way that representation is shown at a local and state level is through census data. You can go to the next slide. Awesome. So we're going to get into a little bit of census operations and talk a little bit about the key census dates to keep in mind. So I did want to note that, and sorry, a little bit of this is cut off, but you can get these slides afterwards if you're interested. There are a lot of shifts due to coronavirus around census operations. We want to give you just the quick snapshot of some of these changes. So you'll see them in yellow on your screen right now. But the census started January 21st in remote Alaska, and there's specific operations around counting folks in remote Alaska. That was supposed to end a little earlier this year, but it's been extended until June 19th. And then a lot of you have seen that a lot of letters have gone out, letters of invitation, the internet self-response portal where many people can fill out the form this year, which is at 2020census.gov. Those first letters of invitation and the internet self-response portal all went live on March 12th. You may have seen an uptick on people talking about the census. That was April 1, Census Day, which was really exciting and a way for us to think about how to count yourself. I'll talk about Census Day in just a minute, but just take a look at what's changed over the next few months. So a lot of field offices have closed because they wanted to ensure that there was the health and safety of the Census Bureau workers along with the community members by ensuring that there was not direct contact. So a lot of those offices have been closed. But last week on May 4th, some field offices have started to open up again. And those are they're determining those based on the number of cases that they're seeing and the trends in coronavirus cases. June 1st is when most field offices will be at peak operations and will be opening up. And this is what we've heard from the Census Bureau, but some of this may change again, just based on what happens with the virus. There's a couple different operations. I know that some folks on here are specifically interested in rural communities and how they get counted. There's specific operations around update leave, where the Census Bureau actually comes by households and leaves packets at the door. And then update enumerate, where Census Bureau enumerators go door to door and do those interviews in person. So those have changed and shifted as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the other measures later on in the presentation that the Census Bureau is taking to think through how to be safe during this time. And the biggest one is non-response follow-up. So a lot of our communities, especially hard to count communities, which we'll talk about in a moment, those communities get counted during non-response follow-up. And non-response follow-up is what you think of with the traditional door-to-door knocking that enumerators do. So originally that was supposed to start, or excuse me, the entire non-response follow-up process was supposed to end on July 31st. It was supposed to start May 13th. But this has been pushed all the way to August. So we'll see what that looks like when it happens, but the Census Bureau is already preparing for how their door-to-door enumerators will be safe and ensure safety among the communities that they're counting. And then that extension, so when it was originally supposed to end July 31st, is now going to end October 31st. So keep that in mind. One thing I wanted to go back to is April 1, which was Census Day. That is the day, the reason that it's called Census Day is that the census is a pretty long process, as you can see from this timeline. And you have to think about a lot can happen in a few months. So say that you were living in another apartment, or say you bought a house within that 6-month process, and you're wondering, well, wait, which address should I get counted at? So this April 1 is a marker to determine where you were on April 1 is where you should get counted. And so think about that when folks are asking questions potentially in the future about where they should get counted, what address they should use, or even potentially if they had a kid, was that kid born before April 1 or on April 1 when they should get counted. And then again, just a couple deadlines that have been extended. So the deadline for state population totals has been extended to April 30th of 2021. And then the deadline for redistricting has also been extended to July 31st. This will impact representation and the way redistricting works. And we're still trying to figure out what those impacts might look like. You can go to the next slide.
Awesome. So I'm going to talk a little about some of the challenges we face with the census, right? Obviously, with COVID-19, there has been a ton of shift, but even just in general, right? Census face inherently its own natural challenges, and so I want to talk a little about that. And so, census has historically missed and not counted all population groups equally. And so we want to think about, and Sonum mentioned this, right? Some of the hard to count communities. And as we think about that, we're facing those counts in terms of people of color, low-income households. Sensa mentioned her sister, right, and her sister's child. So thinking about folks under 0 to 4, right, are not being counted, especially Black and Black and Latino kids across the country are not being counted. We think about language barriers, so folks with limited English proficiency in foreign-born households, and then thinking about multi-generational households. Thinking about who lives in a household, and are all those people to be counted in a particular census form. And then also young adult people who are renting, right? And so those transient kind of population where they're moving from household to household. You can go to the next slide. And so we want to think about some of the causes of undercounting and some of those omissions, right? And so these are some of the different reasons why we see some of this. Ones I always like to kind of lift up and raise, I think it's, especially think about some of the hard to count communities, right? We think about lack of internet access. We think about a distrust of government. I think especially as we think about immigrant communities, right? There's sometimes a perception that filling out the census, right, may lead to then disclosure of what your household, right, looks like. And then your, right, one status or a family member status. And so thinking about, that folks will not fill out a census because like, well, now you got my address, right? And now you've got some of these different personal information identifiers, right? And so we'll talk a little more about some of that protection around in there that's built into the census. But these are just some of the reasons why. Also, I think we think about, right, displacement, folks who might be home insecure. And so those barriers exist within census around what that means and folks being able to count. Go to the next slide. And these hard to count communities are hard to count for a reason. And so we mentioned a little about this, right? So again, these are some of the very real fears about deportation, persecution based on documentation. We talked a little about the distrust of government. There's a lack of information around the process as well. I think this particular census is an interesting one, right? Because it's our kind of first time seeing an online census. So there's kind of information around what that means and what that looks like, different family structure, involved in what does that mean around counting particular communities, recognizing that, right, culturally there are differences around who lives in a household, right? What does that mean and how do you define a household when you get the census questionnaire? Being mobile, unhoused, or having an unregistered residence, like what does that mean when it comes to a census? So all of these pieces, and we know that again, this historically falls into certain communities, and makes those communities specifically hard to count as we go through this. And so that's a real emphasis of this, especially the Census Counts campaign, right? That we want to ensure a full, accurate, and fair census and making sure that we're counting everybody. We can go to the next slide. And so Sonam mentioned that we want to make this interactive. So we want to get a sense from you, right? Who do you think, right? Who do you believe are hard to count in your community? So I know there's like a nice national landscape of the folks, right, from that's on this call, this webinar. So I want to get a sense from you, who is hard to count in your community? So just go ahead and take about 30 seconds to just put this in the chat box. Who is hard to count in your community? Apartment renters, absolutely. Unhoused, refugees, low income, African Americans, youth, renters, refugees, undocumented, absolutely. Language barrier. I love that there was like a very specific, right? Refugees, specifically considered around language barriers and undocumented community members. The elderly, absolutely. Especially with a electronic census now, then that's not the only way you can respond, but that, with that adds a piece of that. Housing communities, HUD, children, folks who distrust government, absolutely. New Americans, babies, and children. These are all great answers. We'll go to the next slide. Right, so those are all great answers. All your definitions, right, really do cover and hard to count communities have a large spectrum, right? I think especially as you think about this across the country, even some of the hard to count communities, right, reside in rural communities. And so even thinking about that geography makes a big part and difference, right? And what that means if you think about hard to count communities. So, right, as we think about the challenges we face for the 2020 census, this is our first high-tech census, right? So the first time that we've been able to fill out the census through an online form, which is, right, provides its own unique challenges. But I think even as we think about COVID, right, not that we were, forecasting a global pandemic, but thinking about like that we actually implemented this right in kind of the midst of this, where there's some of the silver lining with that, right? That like at least we have an option now to be able to fill this out remotely. There's the fear, right? And kind of there was some of the fear and specter of the citizenship question being on the census form. That is not on the census form, right? But it's something that was always a fear for many of the communities that you all mentioned: undocumented, refugees, right? Folks who might have issues with right, language barriers. So all of that, the fear of government, again, that distrust, and then COVID-19 obviously provides its own very, very unique challenges, especially as we think about non-response follow-up, as Sonum mentioned, which is one of those tactics that we know actually is actually geared towards and effective in terms of reaching out to hard to count communities. So something we're watching really closely, because that's a big part of how do we actually get out to hard to count communities. We're going to go to the next slide. And so I want to talk a little about completing the form. So we can actually go to the next one. And so, right, Sona mentioned, right, the census takes about 10 minutes to fill out, right, if you're doing it online, even if you're doing it on the paper questionnaire, or if you're doing call, right, you can call in as well. And so what do we think is on this? So what's on the census? There's a lot of short questions, right? We're about age, sex this is kind of the only binary option here. Race and origin, you can relationship and status and household. And there's a new piece of this that I'll cover in a little bit later. Home ownership, right? You're an owner or a renter, telephone number, and an information on additional people living in the home. And so one note, right, you want to make sure that we're counting. So if your census, Sonum had mentioned that April 1st, right? So if that's your primary residence, that's where you are going to be most of the time in a residence, right? We want to tracking everybody that is in that household. We can go to the next slide. So a little quiz for you all. What will not be on the census form? Go ahead and type that into the chat box really quick. Give me 30 seconds. What will not be on the census form? Little mid-webinar quiz. Favorite NBA team? I love that one. That is a good one. Favorite NBA? Which party you vote for? Absolutely. Citizenship question. Good. Any others? What will not be on the census form? Favorite NBA team is going to be my new favorite one. That's a great response. Social Security information. Great. Any others? Social Security. All right, let's go to the next slide. Right, what the 2020 census question will not ask you. So we were right. Citizenship status, correct, will not be on there. Social Security number will not be on there. These are some of the other examples, right, of what will not be on the census form. It will not ask you your citizenship status. It will not ask you immigration status. It will not ask people Social Security number, permit or licensing of any converted units or property. It will not ask about public benefits, right? That was another big fear and concern, is that, right, that the census, filling out the census may end up jeopardizing one's or family's public benefits. It will not ask criminal background or convictions information. It will never ask for bank account or payment information, employment income, or any other type of wealth information. It would also not ask you what party you're voting for and your favorite NBA team. And so these are all some of the things that will not be asking you on the census form. And so it's critical to be mindful of these. And as you all are thinking about, especially the hard to count communities, right, this is something that we want to continue to reinforce and to continue to message out there, right? Some of the, especially these kind of first three pieces to this. Citizenship question is, no matter how much we want to continue to be asking this, reaffirming to our communities, right, that citizenship status will not be asked on there, your immigration status will not be asked on there, and your social security number. These things will not be asked on the census form as we think about filling it out. So let's go to the next slide, if you don't mind. Now there are some new things that are added onto the census, right? And so there is a new household relationship category that allows couples living there to identify their relationships, either same sex or opposite sex, right? So this is something where same sex households or opposite sex households will be able to identify there. And there's some new write-in areas under the race question, for example, for the non-Hispanic origins, right? For example, those who identify as white or black can now add in, right, German and Jamaican are among some of the provided examples on there. So there's options there now to really be able to, I think, identify clearly what you or anyone in your household is identifying as. And so there are areas in there to be able to write into that. And so being able to just identify. And so there's an opportunity here, right, within the census around self-identification. And so encouraging folks, however you self-identify, how you identify in terms of your identity, we want to make sure that that's an opportunity for you as you fill out your census to be able to bring that into the census. And so I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide and then pass it back on to Sonum.
Great. So now that you've learned a little bit about the census basics, well, let's talk about how you can organize in your community and what we like to call get out the count. You may have heard of Get Out the Vote, GOTV. This is get out the count, so getting folks counted. So just a couple background on what the phases of GOTC look like. So phase 1 was from January to March, and it was really around education and awareness. So really educating communities that the census is coming. It's really important why the stakeholders should fill it out. Starting to build just the baseline knowledge of what the census is and why it's important. Started in January. It actually started a little bit earlier than January, but really built up to March when the census went live and it actually started. Go to the next slide. Okay, and then phase 2. So phase 2 was March to April. It was really just big on really launching the census. So this was all about self-response, filling out the form, why it's so incredibly important and why people should go online or by phone to fill out the census. The reason it's started to shift in April and what we'll talk about in phase 3 is that now that the census forms are, a lot of census forms were mailed out. So after about 4 mailings, in the 5th mailing, you get a census form and you can actually fill it out there and mail it back. And so the idea is that groups are really engaging on get out the count efforts. We originally were planning on doing in-person events and really providing the means, whether it's internet providers or like Wi-Fi hotspots or just tablets in general to allow people to fill it out in person. But because coronavirus picked up, we moved everything to remote. So a lot of people have been doing phone banking, text banking, starting to direct calls into the bureau so people can fill it out by phone. So a lot of these methods have shifted, and you can go to phase 3, the next slide. And so phase 3, this is actually extended. So it does say May 2020 to July 2020, but now this is basically May until October. So here is where we really want to mobilize people. This is when people are going to start seeing people coming door to door, whether it's from update leave or update enumerate. And I went over some of those dates earlier. And this is when groups on the ground really have to engage with their communities to let stakeholders know that enumerators are going to be coming door to door. What do those enumerators look like? How can they access these resources and access census resources in general in language, and understand what the census is and why it's so important to self-respond prior to getting these people coming to their doors. And you can go to the next slide. Great. So we're going to talk a little bit about tactics too. So what are ways that you all can get involved and start building out your own get out the count plan so that you're organizing in your own community? So some field tactics to think about is relational organizing. What is relational organizing? It's organizing within the relationships that you've already built. So organizing in your community. And that looks like a bunch of different things. That could be text banking, phone banking, doing things where you're actually calling people that you know in your network, you're emailing people in your network, and you're texting people in your network to talk about why the census is so important and how they can fill it out. And then all of these other tactics, so you can do a roundtable, you can do presentations similar to this, so you can have potentially a Zoom party and talk about how you can fill out the census. You could share your screen, show the website. You can do community forums, so talk to about bringing everyone together virtually to talk about the census and answer questions on how to fill it out. And then the other thing to do is partner with organizations that are already in your community doing this great work, so that you can talk about it to community members that are looking for it. And then again, I mentioned phone banks, but phone banking is a very helpful way of reaching people. And we'll talk a little bit about some tactics for rural areas a little later on. Digital ways to engage, think about social media. A lot of people are really active on social media right now because they can't be interacting in person. So think about how to post on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and talk about the census. Think about, there are a couple different products out there, or applications that you can use, like SMS texting or Hustle, where you're able to do these texting programs to talk to people about topics, but the census included. Do an email blast if you have a listserv and you're communicating with them on the other issues that you're working on. Mention the census, talk about how important it is to your community, and then link to the census website for folks to fill out. If you have any money that you're able to spend, you can also do ad buys on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And then just think about media. So right now, people are accessing the media more than ever because they're interested in getting updates on coronavirus. And it's so important that if you are able to, that you're able to find space to also talk about the importance of the census while being very thoughtful about what people are going through right now. And so think about the different types of media that are out there. There's print, so think about just the newspapers. It doesn't have to be a big newspaper, your local newspaper, but also if there's in-language ethnic media that you can access, go to them and see if they're interested in doing something on census. You can do radio, you could do an interview or a public service announcement. There's television, local television, and then you could write a letter to the editor or do an op-ed. And then think about storytelling. A lot of people find the census pretty boring because it can seem pretty wonky, but think about how you can tell a personal story about how the census can impact you and why it's so incredibly important that our communities don't get missed. And then podcasts. A lot of people have podcasts. So see if you can go on a podcast and talk about the census. All of these things are just great opportunities to get out there and talk about it. Next slide. Great, and I'm going to turn it back over to Ariel to talk about some of the other tools.
Awesome. So monitoring count is really important for folks, right? So especially as you all are all kind of thinking about get out the count efforts, you're thinking about how do we make sure that we're getting hard to count communities counted. And I think one of the pieces too is always the biggest question, like how do we know who is being counted, right? And what the response rates will look like. And so monitoring counts is really important. Self-response rates from the Census Bureau, they are available. And so we are able to track this. Actually, we're going to dive into some of a tool that you can use actually to be able to look at some of the response rates. So day-to-day self-response rates, that's combined internet, paper, and the phone CQA responses, right? We're looking at some of the rates for the internet self-response. And then these rates are going to be comparable to the 2010 census rates. So you're going to be able to look at a kind of a side-by-side comparison of where we are as of today, and then also what the kind of 2010 final self-response rate was at last time. So I'm going to go ahead, we're going to go to the next slide. And this will give you just a screenshot of the tool that we're actually going to go into now. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you all so I can show you a tool. And thank you all for those who have put in their zip code. So I'm going to bring up the chat really quick so I can see where you're all at. And so let me get rid of this. So hopefully you're seeing my screen. You're seeing what we see is it's the CUNY Census Hard to Count map. And so when we go back to the slide deck, you'll actually be able to see the website. And so this is a tool that you'll all be able to have access to. So thank you all for putting zip codes in here. So I'm going to go ahead and put some zip codes. You can search by zip code across the country, right? And so as you can see, very high level, right? What we're seeing here is the US response rate as a whole, right? So right now we're at 59%. This is compared to the 2010 response rate, right, of 66.5. Now, again, be mindful that we're obviously also really focused and heavy on, right, like hard to count communities. And so we want to think about like, well, then how do we do that? And so I'll use the first one we saw here, which is 48390. And that looks like Michigan, Wolverine Lake. Okay, so give it a second. And then what we'll see here now, right? So we're in Oakland County, Michigan. And so what's going to happen is, right now we're able to see what these response rates are at, right? So we're looking at what the larger response rate is. And then when we look at the track, now we can go from track to track here, right? And so as I move my mouse, if it will, right, we can select different tracks. But for the zip code, that's track 1343. And so as of to yesterday, we're at 78.8%, right? Now, as we compare this, we're actually on track with that's 2010. So if we keep the efforts up, right, we're actually really on track to surpass our 2010 response rates here, right, within this zip code. I'm gonna pull up one more zip code here that we saw. I'll do 35203. That's Birmingham, Alabama. And then again, this tool you'll be able to use across for any one of your zip codes. If it'll go. One more second. So Birmingham, right? And so the different colors you're seeing on here, right, give you the percentages for each of these respective areas. And so now that I have this for this area, as you see, like if I go to track 12, right, where close in the, so track 14 in Jefferson County, right? So right now we're at 41.6% compared to 60% in 2010. Now, if I click this, it'll give me a ton of additional data that you can start to really hone in and kind of drive into. So this tool is really intended, as you're all thinking about get out the count efforts, to think about how you can then shift potentially your get out the count, right, efforts in that particular community. If you're seeing, right, response rates climb in a particular area, one, you may know that, like, okay, what we're doing is working, but then you also potentially want to think about, right, do we make a decision to shift, right, resources and efforts into another community where you may see that response rates are really low. And so this is an opportunity to be able to think about how you want to focus and hone in all of your efforts on the ground to think about how you're particularly addressing some of these get out the count efforts. And so there's a lot of different features in here. It's something that, you know, we spend a little more time on in a full day training diving into, but this is a tool that we absolutely encourage you all to go on to. You can Google, again, CUNY hard to count maps or Census hard to count maps 2020. And you can dive in and play with this at your leisure. There's a ton of great resources here. So absolutely encourage each and every one of you to dive in on when you can. So I'm going to stop sharing, give it back to Anthony. So thank you all for putting your zip codes in. Again, you can feel free to go ahead and dive into this at your leisure when you like. Cool. Let Anthony get back on the slides. And then I'm actually just going to go ahead and pass it right back on to Sonum to dive into some support.
Great, thanks. And just to let folks know, I put the link for the hard to count map in the chat box, so you can just copy and paste that directly into your browser. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about language support, because I know that is something that a lot of us here are really concerned about. So just some language support that's provided so far. So the Census Bureau does have language guides in 59 languages plus English. Don't have them off the top of my head, but I'm happy to provide them afterwards. These language guides are a helpful way to kind of walk through what's on the census form. However, there is a lot of need from local organizations and nonprofits, especially in the community, to provide additional language support, because a guide isn't necessarily as useful as having someone that can directly translate and walk through the form itself. Again, if folks want to fill out the form online or by phone, there are 12 languages plus English. And so there are support staff from the Census Bureau that can do, that can help fill out the form directly by phone, or if you go online, you can actually switch into a different language. Again, it's really important to work with community members. And I just wanted to list off some of the amazing nonprofit organizations at a national level that are working to do a lot of translations, not of just of materials, but of fact sheets and flyers and other promotional materials that you can print and directly use in your organizing. So AAJC, Asian Americans Advancing Justice, they have their countusin2020.org/resources, and you can see the languages there that they provide translations in. And then NALEO, the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, has their Hágase Contar campaign and their website, which has Spanish translations. And then there is Yalla Count Me In, which is a campaign of the Arab American Institute, and they provide Arabic resources as well. You can go to the next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about what to expect when a Census Bureau is coming to your door. Again, this shouldn't happen for a little bit, but with some rural areas, there is an operation called Update Leave, where they're going door to door and they are not having contact with people, but they're dropping off a census packet, which includes a paper form, as well as the option if they would like to go online or by phone. So they'll be dropping those off in rural areas, and that will start in June. And so it's still important that people know who these people are, and when non-response follow-up starts, that you can identify a Census Bureau enumerator. And so here are just a couple things to keep an eye out for. They'll have their name and their photograph on an ID badge, and they'll have the Department of Commerce watermark and an expiration date. And they'll have an official bag and a Census Bureau issued electronic device. They're also looking into the type of personal protective equipment that they will be providing Census Bureau employees with. We're still unsure what that looks like because we're still waiting for the Census Bureau to provide full details, but they have said that they're planning for this. We can go to the next slide. So this is what we've heard so far, and this is really in the context of Update Leave. So that operation that I just talked about with rural households, this is what they're planning for. So they'll have, each employee will have masks and hand sanitizers as they deliver the census packets, and they'll deliver them on porches and front doors, but will not have interaction with the people when they drop them off. They will not knock on household doors and avoid in-person contact. And they'll also receive safety training on social distancing protocols. So this is just for Update Leave. We're unsure about how non-response follow-up will go, but that is a few months out, so we'll see what they say. You can go to the next slide. I wanted to highlight just a few other resources at your fingertips. So there are a number of census protection hotlines. Obviously, it's scary having someone come to your door, and also people, just like Ariel mentioned earlier, there's a lot of reasons why people don't want to fill out the form. A lot of it has to do with the fear in government. And so we wanted to make sure that we as a coalition and our partners were available to our community members as trusted messengers to provide insight and answer questions, and also be there if they need additional language support. So you can see the hotlines there. There's the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. That's in English, but a lot of what they're doing is really thinking through any types of potential for fraud and what you'll hear about with disinformation later. They're answering questions there. NALEO has a Spanish hotline and also in English to answer any questions. Similar with Asian Americans Advancing Justice and Arab American Institute having their in-language hotlines. We also have a census help desk. So if you go to our website, www.censuscounts.org, you can actually use the chat box. There's a little picture there if you see the example, to ask questions. And we also have a chat bot that will answer questions as well about the census. These are in English right now, but I know that I'm pretty sure NALEO's Hágase Contar website has the same feature in Spanish. So these are just a couple different resources. We will provide these slides afterwards so you can access them, but just want to let you all know that these are available for you all to use and for your community members to use. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk about messaging. I know we don't have a ton of time, so I'm going to try to run through this pretty quickly, but how to talk about the census and why it's important in your community. So ensure that you're identifying resources missing from people's lives and link them directly to census. You can go to the next slide. There's 3 key elements that we think about. The census is easy, takes 10 minutes, really quick. It's really important for all of those reasons that you mentioned earlier, education, healthcare, the resources in your community, and then it's protected. So we want to say that there are confidentiality protections for people that may be afraid of providing information to the government. I'm going to talk a little bit about some specific messaging in just a second. You can go to the next slide. Okay, great. So I wanted to share this slide from the Fair Immigration Reform Movement, as well as Community Change. So they're a really great partner. They're doing a lot of great census work. And if you work with immigrant communities, they have a lot of great resources. But these are just some winning narratives, and I really wanted to focus on that last box. Again, lead with values, stay positive, empowering, calm, authentic, and resolute. Draw a picture of what we can secure for our communities when we work together for an accurate count. Again, don't lie. Don't say that it's safe. We're unsure about what could be in the future, but say that it's confidential and that there are laws in place for that protection of personal data. And then talk a lot about where people are. You can tell people that their fears are real and empower them to make the decision on their own. And then think through why this would be important for these communities and make it local. So really think about the ways to do that. And there's some other things here that you should check out later. I know we don't have a ton of time, but would definitely encourage you to see the messages here and then also access their resources online as well. You can go to the next slide. Great, so I just want to cover a couple things quickly about how to talk about this with COVID-19 kind of in the background of everyone's minds. So again, we want to be really thoughtful. Many people are seeing a lot of people suffering from this in their communities, whether it's a community member or their family member or themselves. And so the census may not be top of mind. And so we want to also be aware that, you know, other people have other concerns that are top of mind right now. But again, it's easy to fill out. These are just a couple graphics that our coalition members have created around why the census is important. And then again, you can tie it to healthcare. The census is critical for health-related resources. Even determining how many ventilators a community needs will be determined by census data. And so you can look at the direct impacts of something like a pandemic and coronavirus and see that our communities and the preparedness that they need for preparing for something like COVID-19 looks directly at census data. You can go to the next slide. And just a couple other ways to talk about it. A lot of folks are quarantining, some are getting out of it, but to think about the ways to stay busy in quarantine, you can fill out your census. It doesn't require in-person contact, self-response. You can do it online, by phone, or by mail. That does not require talking to anyone or being in contact with anyone, so it's safe. And then talk about the need for this liberated society where everyone has resources to healthcare and wellness. And you can talk about who are the most impacted individuals that you're seeing suffering from coronavirus. Those are the same people that are missed on the census and then don't get those resources in their day-to-day over the next 10 years. You can go to the next slide. So just a couple ways to engage again. If you're gonna engage online, drive people directly to the census page, 2020census.gov. The census is on your phone, so a lot of people that have access to smartphones can access the website as well, and it's mobile friendly. And you don't have to start from scratch. We have tons of graphics across the board with many organizations, which we're going to talk about in a second. And so you can access those and utilize them as much as you want. And then the other thing is hiring. So the Census Bureau has hired their full staff, including enumerators for the fall. However, this may change just based on what's happening with the virus and also the extensions. And so we're still encouraging people to continue to apply. You can apply online at 2020census.gov. And the Census Bureau has been really intentional on trying to hire people that can speak specific languages and are a part of the communities that are hardest to count. And so really encouraging your communities and the people you work with to apply for those jobs. You can go to the next slide. And then I want to also just point out that you don't have to do digital or virtual always. There are other ways to do to get to people. We talked about PSAs and radio, doing those, but also as businesses start opening up, you don't have to go directly to a business, but maybe call them and ask if they're willing to have flyers in essential businesses, and then mail them those flyers. And we have flyers on hand that you can use. And then one-on-one conversations, call up people in your community and ask them if they filled it out, and encourage people that you know to fill that out. Go ahead to the next slide. Great, I'm gonna pass it back to Ariel.
Cool. So I know, so we're tight on time, so I'm going to run through these slides pretty quickly, but I think this is an important section, right? Because we're talking about disinformation. So we can go to the next slide. And so what is disinformation, right? It's any attempt to intentionally confuse or mislead people about the facts of the census in order to interfere with participation. And we've seen a lot of this happening. Misinformation isn't intentional sometimes, right? But the harm can be just as great. And so sometimes this is just a confusion of information, but we are seeing sometimes, right, we see intentionality around this information, trying to mislead people around the census. And so we want to just be really mindful of that and be aware of that. It is out there. It does greatly affect our hard to count communities. And so it is up to all of us, right, to truly try to be able to call some of this out and to try to provide the right information for our constituents and for the folks that we're working with to make sure that we are getting out a full and accurate count. We can go to the next slide. And so first thing to do is report it. We actually have, we're tracking this information, right? We're sharing this also with the Census Bureau. So where we can, we want to make sure. So this is an email that you can all use if you are finding this information out there. So shoot an email to information@censuscounts.org. We don't want to amplify the disinformation, right? So calling attention to disinformation amplifies it. So it's about recognizing it. And we want to be able to, be able to then provide the information that is correct, right? Not necessarily saying, yeah, no, that information's out there and it's going out there, right? And continue to give it a platform. We don't want to do that. But we do want to provide the information that is accurate so that folks have the accurate information. Go to the next slide. So don't give examples of disinformation. Again, it just kind of feeds more fuel to the fire, if you will. We don't want to repeat or share the different falsehoods. We don't want to speculate, right, or give into the fear mongering or even kind of perpetuate the fear mongering. What we want to do is, if it's press, right, and journalists that are asking around, we want press journalists to tell you, right, what evidence that they have. We want to provide accurate facts in the form of inoculation or a balance of messaging, right? So this is kind of an example working to remind folks that it is illegal for the Bureau to share information with other government information, especially personal identifying information. We want to stick to the evidence, right? So since the citizenship question is always one of them that comes up, right? Is the citizenship, the citizenship question is on the census? No, it is not. The citizenship question is not on the census, right? This is what is on the census. And so these are the type of things that we want to kind of be aware of and mindful of. Go to the next slide. What we don't want to do is don't let the conversation solely be about the existence or the impact of the information, right? So you see a little kind of graphic, right? Do not feed the trolls. What we do want to do is describe the situation using accurate and euphemism-free terms as possible, right? So again, thinking about the different communities that we're all trying to work with and get counted in the census, we do want to pivot all of our census-related work, right? The benefits of census participation, and really talk about like why the census is so important, why we should be doing this, and why folks need to be counted in our particular neighborhoods. So we're going to go ahead and go to the next slide. And so as we think about the census counts, right? So, Sonum, you want to kind of dive into these, or you want me to just kind of?
Yeah, I can do them really fast. So we want to tell you about the resources at your fingertips to start organizing. So you can go to the next slide. So we are the Census Counts campaign. We're run through the Leadership Conference, but we really are a coalition of organizations at the national, state, and local level that are working to ensure an accurate count. You can go to the next slide. So there are going to be a list of organizations, some of which you may be familiar with. These are all of the national organizations that are working on this, plus more, but they are really focused in on specific historically undercounted communities and how they as organizations can provide resources to ensure that they get counted. And so these national organizations also work with our state network. You can go to the next slide. And we are in all 50 states. We have state leads where they're building their coalitions on the ground to ensure that their hard to count communities, like the ones that you all looked up through the hard to count map, are getting counted in 2020. And so I really encourage you, if you're in a specific state, I know we mentioned those at the beginning, to go to censuscounts.org/state-by-state and look up who is in your state and how to get plugged in. And you can also email me afterwards if you're looking to get plugged in with these state networks. You can go to the next slide. And I'll go to Ariel to cover.
Awesome. And so one of the specific bodies and networks that I'm working really closely with, so for all those are on the call that might be either an elected official or work in an elected official's office, we have a network, a national network of in all 50 states of over 500 appointed and or elected officials across the country, called the Census Champions Network, right? And really this network is designed to be a resource and a hub for peers to connect across the country, state, local, county, tribal, and elected appointed officials to really that are committed to a fair and accurate count, right? To getting the resources that they need. We provide updates around what's going on with census operations, and we're talking about giving peers a platform really to share best practices, what is working, what's not working. One example is that I know in Phoenix, right, the mayor that we've shared out that folks are really interested in, like, being able to have internet access across the board and folks, right, to have that Wi-Fi access and broadband access to be able to do the census online. They actually ordered and bought vans or converted city vans, right, to drive around neighborhoods with Wi-Fi capability. So they turned those vans into hotspots and went particularly to hard to count communities where they knew internet access was short, right, or the accessibility was low, and was able to be able to turn those, right, in those hotspots into spaces where folks in the community could come or be able to have access right through the van to be able to get online and fill out the census online. So if that's an interest of you, you can, there's an email at the end. I think it's just Sonum. You can shoot us an email, feel free, or even Anthony, and get connected to me, and I can talk about how we can get your elected officials or appointed officials plugged into the network across the country. So for the next slide, and then I think we'll open it up to questions as we kind of come to the end.
All right, great. Thank you both so much. Yeah, a lot of information, obviously. So I appreciate you both going through that. We are coming up on our scheduled end time, so we're gonna move quickly here, but I think we've got time for one or two quick questions, but I do want to leave your contact information up here. As both Ariel and Sonum did mention, the slides will be shared with all of you as part of the follow-up, because I know there were a lot of great resources and links that were included. So you'll be able to go and visit those, and this is being recorded. So we'll be sending out a link to this as well. But I'm gonna leave this here, and let's take a quick look at a question here. So here's one just in regards to kind of our current situation with COVID. With social distancing in place and a challenging online form with people who have limited English language ability, can you share any ideas on how to get around these barriers?
I'll start, and then Ariel, if you want to add to it, please do. So a lot of what organizers and organizations have been doing is thinking through how they can, one, phone bank. So they're calling their community members in language, and they're talking with them about the census. And then they're also, they're patching them through to the Census Bureau. So they're just like basically linking them directly to call and talk to a Census Bureau person to fill out the form itself. Unfortunately, there are some limitations on how much a census advocate like ourselves can do. We cannot collect the information to like fill out someone's form for them. And but what we can do is you can be on the phone with someone and then walk them through how to go online and translate the questions for them so they can fill out the form themselves. So there are some limitations there, but that's what a lot of our groups are doing, especially given coronavirus and the limitations that exist in this virtual world.
The only thing I would add is, so even to what's on your screen right now, censuscounts.org, our resources page has a links to a lot of our coalition partners, right, that Sonum kind of had mentioned. And a lot of these partners have additional languages that the census has not translated the forms into. So being able to tap into those particular resources that our partners have, you'll be able to find that all on our censuscounts.org resources page. So I would also encourage you all, like if there's an opportunity, you can find translated documents already that can help in some of this process.
And one more thing is, if you don't see a language on there, just email us, because there are a lot of organizations, not just the national, but the state level, that have very specific communities that they need translated materials, and we can connect you or at least send you the materials themselves.
Can they contact you at your email address that we've got listed here with that?
Yes, so that's my email on the screen. So
Excellent.
email me.
Yeah, language access is a big thing right now with us, and I'm sure for many others. So thank you for offering that. All right, well, I do want to stay mindful of time and respect everyone on that. So there are a number of other questions that we could keep going on, but I'm going to go ahead and wind us up. I do know a lot of you also shared some questions during the registration process. And so we will get with you in regards to some responses to those. So we'll definitely follow up with you. But as I mentioned, everything today has been recorded. We'll be sharing that out with you in the next probably 24 hours or so, as well as a link to, or a copy of the slides that have been shared via PDF. So look for that. On behalf of our attendees today, Sonum and Ariel, thank you both so much for sharing all of this great knowledge and information and your time. We really do appreciate it. And to all of you, our attendees, thank you for sharing with us. We do have a couple of more webinars related to our COVID series that are coming up, and we'll be sharing some information with you about that here very soon. But if you have any questions about today's topic, you can send an email to events@welcomingamerica.org, or if you have any topics that you want to see us cover as well, feel free to reach out and let us know there. So again, thank you all so much for taking the time to join us today, and stay well, stay safe, and we will see you again very soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for having us.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.